Welcome to the Vitamin Professor podcast, brought to you by VRM Media, publisher of vitamin retailer and nutrition industry executive magazines, in partnership with Nutraland USA. I'm your host, Gene Bruno, Professor Emeritus of Nutraceutical Science and Chief Scientific Officer of Nutraland USA. The purpose of this podcast is to help educate the dietary supplement industry about the science of nutraceuticals and other relevant topics. If you like what you hear and see, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let me tell you a little bit about our guest today. Dr. Jonny Bowden is a board-certified nutritionist, a member of the faculty of Functional Medicine Coaching Academy, and a nationally known expert on weight loss and healthy aging. His no-nonsense, myth-busting approach has made him a popular guest on television. It's like Dr. Oz, The Doctors, ABC TV, MSNBC TV, CNN, CBS TV, CBN, Fox News, and a bunch of others. And he's been on morning shows. He's been a popular guest on podcasts such as Dr. Gundry, Fast Like a Girl, and many others. Now, in addition to all of that, he's also a best-selling author of over a dozen books, including The 150 Healthiest Foods on Earth, The Most Effective Ways to Live Longer, Living Low Carb, and, with cardiologist Stephen Sinatra, a fellow I know, the controversial bestseller, The Great Cholesterol Myth, which has been revised and expanded. Today, Dr. Bowden will be talking with us about Thymoquin from Nutra, which is distributed in the U.S. by Barrington, and the relationship of that Thymoquin to cortisol. Welcome, Dr. Bowden.
Nice to see you.
You know, we're hearing a lot about the hormone cortisol. There's videos out there you see, and especially on TikTok, talking about how to lower cortisol. So can you tell our listeners exactly what is cortisol and why are people so concerned about it?
Well, as usual, 2-minute TikTok videos don't tell the whole story.
No, say it ain't so.
So cortisol is actually a hormone without which you could not live. It's a very, very critical and important hormone, just like insulin. The problem with cortisol has to do with it being on too much. So if the analogy I always use about cortisol, and I'll get into what it really is and what it does and why we even have it, but it's like first gear on a car. You want first gear on a car. It will get you out of a ditch. It will get you out of a snow thing where you're stuck. It's very, very important for your survival of you and your car. But you don't want to be coasting down the 405 freeway at 90 miles an hour in first gear, because you will ruin the car. And you don't want to be coasting through your life with high levels of cortisol, or you will ruin your metabolism. And that's why everybody's, let's bring down cortisol, but let's understand what cortisol does and why we have it in the first place, because we wouldn't be here without it. So it's not a bad hormone. So when you or your Paleolithic ancestors were ranging on the African Serengeti and relaxing, and all of a sudden you heard a rustling of a lion or a predator or something, the first thing that happens is your hypothalamus sends a message to your pituitary. This all happens in a microsecond. It's a nanosecond. Pituitary sends a message to your adrenal glands. Your adrenal glands are these two little things that look like walnuts, and they sit on top of the kidneys. And it says to the adrenal glands, this guy's in danger. The adrenal glands take cortisol and adrenaline, the corticoids, cortisol and adrenaline, everybody knows what adrenaline is, and it floods the body with those two hormones. Why? Because cortisol does a number of things. You're going to have to run away from that lion or that woolly mammoth, right? It gets you ready for running. It is called the fight or flight hormone. It gets you prepared to pick up a stick and fight off the animal or to run up a tree. Your heart rate goes up. Your blood pressure goes up. It diverts blood from the areas you don't need it. What do you need it in the stomach to digest food when you're about to become food? So what it does is it moves blood away from there and it sends it where? To the legs and the arms so that you can run faster or pick up a bigger club. So cortisol is a survival hormone, and you need it every time for an emergency. Here's the problem. We got this primitive brain that doesn't know we're in the 21st century. And now, if you're late for soccer practice with your kid, your body thinks you're being attacked by a lion. So it sends your cortisol rising, and you're in the car like this, going, I'm going to be late, I'm going to be late, and your cortisol is on the roof. And it stays there, and it stays there, and it stays there. And why this is a bad thing is because cortisol does several things. Number one, and this gets everybody's attention, and this is the one that everybody perks up and goes, oh, I better pay. It makes you fat. It literally sends a signal to the body to put weight, to store weight around the abdomen, which is the most dangerous kind of metabolically.
A lot of visceral fat surrounding the organs.
So it is sending a long-term message, emergency state, store this fat for an emergency. Because what is an emergency really in a primitive state? It's no food, right? And so the body is seeing you in an emergency situation and is sending metabolic signals to store fat around the middle. Number two, what does cortisol do? It breaks down muscle. When I began 30-something years ago at Equinox, I didn't know any of this. And we used to have these executives who came in, many women, executives, top PR agents, top editors. And they would get on that treadmill, and they would work, and they would work. And they always had this pooch. They couldn't get rid of the pooch. They couldn't get rid of this. I did not know why. I figured they better exercise more or they better eat less. We didn't know anything back then in the 90s, right? But what that is stress fat. We now know that that is the body taking the stresses of the day and telling the body to store extra fat for that emergency that it's sure is going to come. And that was the secret to why those people weren't losing that extra little bit of weight. So cortisol puts on fat. It burns up muscle. Now let's remember,
not a good thing. But
not only not a good thing, let me just tell you, Gene, that there is a saying now that's going around in the anti-aging community, the biohacking community, and the saying is muscle is the organ of longevity. Think about it. When do you die? When are you most at risk? When you're frail. When are you frail? When you have no muscle.
Sure.
So you don't want a hormone eating up muscle. What cortisol is basically doing, why does it eat up muscle? Because it's the same way as if you're on a sailboat and your life is in danger and you're all freezing and stuff, you'll burn the sail for wood and fuel. You don't want to do that, but it's the only choice you have, and that's what cortisol does with the muscles. Is this guy needs energy to run away from that lion, and it will burn the muscle. And that's exactly what you don't want to happen. Muscle is your ally in losing weight, and it's your ally in
so
and the third thing it does, it shrinks an area of the brain called the hippocampus, which has to do with memory and thinking. So cortisol in high amounts for extended amounts of time is a really bad thing. And that's why people are talking about lowering it.
Well, that makes a great deal of sense. So, of course, here's the million-dollar question is, what can people do to help bring down their cortisol levels, or at least get them in a healthy range? And, what supplements can help with this?
Well, we're going to get to supplements in a minute, but I have to put them in context. The absolutely best thing you can do for this is meditation, deep breathing, relaxation, Epsom salts, relaxing baths. That's the real stuff. But supplements can also help. There aren't a lot of them that have been shown in research to help, but there are two. And the one we're going to talk about today is one of them, which is black seed oil, specifically in the form of Thymoquin. And there is now good research. I know the researcher. He's a friend of mine, Sean Talbot. He's probably one of my cortisol go-tos. He's as knowledgeable about cortisol as anybody I know in the field, PhD. And he did a really interesting study on stress which is cortisol. We're always talking about cortisol when you're talking about stress. And athletes. Because the thing is that as much as we all know exercise is great for you and all of that stuff, there are some downsides, one of which is the big stressor. Why do you think marathoners almost always get sick after the marathon? I mean, you're smiling, right? It's a known fact. I mean, anybody who knows run a marathon, higher chance of getting a bad cold or getting a little bit sick afterwards because their immune system is suppressed.
Right.
And that is the stress of continued cortisol. It suppresses the immune system. So the athletes get stressed. So he took a group of athletes, people who were doing regular training, as a very good example of people who had, higher stress levels than you might want. And he gave them Thymoquin. And I think it was I'm not sure of the study design. I think it was a crossover period, like they would have the active ingredient for 2 weeks, then they would have a washout period, and then they would have the placebo. It was a very well-designed study. It was a very good study. And for our purposes, talking about cortisol, the reduction in cortisol for those people under stress was a whopping 44%.
That's pretty significant.
It's very significant. And that's as good as I've seen in terms of supplements. Phosphatidylserine is another supplement that has some decent research behind it, but this cortisol research on Thymoquin is very recent and very impressive. And I think I know we're here to talk about the connection to cortisol, but the fact is that black seed oil, particularly the Thymoquin version of it, and I can tell you why I like that the best, has many metabolic effects. You mentioned my book, The Great Cholesterol Myth. The revised version really is talking about healthy metabolism. And we talk a lot in that book about insulin resistance, which I call the metabolic plague of the 21st century. 93% of it, Dr. Gene, 93% of us in America have some measure, some metric indicating metabolic syndrome. What is that? Prediabetes. Metabolic syndrome, syndrome X. The World Health Organization now calls it cardiometabolic syndrome. It's a thing. And
sure.
We used to tell people 88% of Americans have this. If you go to Google right now and Google 88% of Americans metabolically unhealthy, or only 12% of America is metabolically healthy, you will find articles like that, but it's out of date. You know why? Because it's not 88% anymore. It's up to 93%. So we're talking about a metabolic disaster for our health. And black seed oil and Thymoquin actually help a number of metabolic parameters, not just lowering cortisol. They're really good for a lot of the things that are associated with insulin resistance, which is one reason why I'm actually thinking about I have some I do private counseling, and I have some foundational supplements that I recommend to everybody. Obviously, I think everyone, I'm sure you agree with this, everybody's biochemically unique. We all need individual vitamin prescriptions. I do private counseling, I do genetic testing. I do a lot of things to figure out what's best for this particular person. But that said, in terms of return on investment, in terms of the most value for the most number of people, I have like 3 or 4 basic things, and I'm very seriously considering adding Thymoquin to one of those basic foundational supplements for metabolic health because of all the good things that it does, not just for cortisol, but for all the other problems.
Well, yeah, I certainly agree with you on that. As you know, right before we started this podcast today, I was telling you I've actually written a couple of articles for Vitamin Retailer on Thymoquin, on the research, and it's pretty significant. So there's that's one of the reasons I personally take it. But there's so much on it. I mean,
I'm not, every single day.
Yeah, that's the one I take.
Yeah.
And it's a great product because it does do so much. So I could certainly appreciate your enthusiasm for this because I do share that. And yeah.
No, go ahead.
And so, what are the things about? So, tell me what makes this Thymoquin instead of just say any generic thymoquinone. What makes this one a little better than the others? What would be
I'll tell you exactly.
Yeah.
So let's back up and talk about why we buy black seed oil in the first place. So much like with olive oil, there are many compounds in black seed oil that are called bioactives. That means they have actual biological activity in the human body. Olive oil is loaded with them. Black seed oil has quite a number of them as well. And the main one, the one that gets all the attention, just like in turmeric, curcumin gets all the attention because it's the most important, or the curcuminoids.
Yeah.
In black seed oil, the most important bioactive is something called thymoquinone. So there is like 70 gazillion black seed oil products out there. And just like they did with CBD, just like they did with a dozen other things I can think of, everybody found out, oh, thymoquinone, that's the thing in black seed oil. Let's make a really high thymoquinone product. And then they started an arms race. Well, I got 5%, I got 10%, I got 20%. And everybody thought more is better. That is not how it works. Thymoquin works its magic in a context, in an ecology, kind of in synergy with other bioactives. And there's one particular ingredient in black seed oil that has a very profound effect on the efficiency of thymoquin, and that is free fatty acids. Now, this is not an anti-fat thing. I'm a big high-fat diet guy. I love, I'm all in on fat. Free fatty acids are not bound. They're just floating around, and they have a tendency to get rancid, to oxidize, to get damaged. And guess what happens when that happens? The thymoquin doesn't work so good.
Right.
So if the formulator is not looking at the relationship between thymoquinone and its arch enemy, free fatty acids, in this context, I'm not saying fat's the enemy, I'm saying free fatty acids in this context are the enemy of effective thymoquinone. They're not even looking at that. They're just going, we got the most thymoquinone. Yeah, but it ain't working, buddy. It's not doing its job. What I love about thymoquin is that they have standardized a relationship. 3% thymoquinone, guaranteed, and less than 2% free fatty acids. And they often get it, it's often 1.5%. So that relationship is powerful and effective. And that's why so many researchers, so many of the studies, I've looked at the studies. I, full disclosure, have helped them with some scientific advisory board stuff, and I'm going through the studies for their website to see what I think should be on their website. And there's like a lot of studies, and a lot of them, not all of them, use thymoquin. And I think the reason that they use it as their black seed oil is because it's reliable, it's standardized, and there's a patent on that particular relationship.
And just further to what you're saying, I've looked at some of the research as well, and I've also looked at some of the different products that are on the market. And there's an interesting study that was conducted showing some of the different products, the thymoquin products. And you mentioned the thymoquin is, 3% thymoquinone and less than 2% free fatty acids. But there's other products on the market. There's one that's 3% thymoquinone, but 24% free fatty acids. Holy mackerel! That's like crazy.
Yes, that's completely crazy. And it's all marketing. You have to remember, marketing met science and marketing won. So, the fact is, this is way more effective than a product that's 4% thymoquinone.
You got to have the balance. If you don't have the balance, it's a problem.
You got to have the balance, not just a number you can, point to that, taken out of context. And this is true in absolutely every area of health that we know of. Hormone balancing. I mean, I'm friendly with and was a consultant to some of these hormone replacement clinics and stuff like that. They don't just give you testosterone or estrogen. It's got to be in balance with the other hormones, or it's not going to work, and it's going to do destruction.
Absolutely. So One of the things you mentioned in this conversation is that, look, and I want to get to, the research on Thymoquin with regard to cortisol, but I'd like to just have you take a moment to just talk about maybe a couple of the different other areas of research. Like what has research shown that Thymoquin is particularly good for? Just let our listeners know a little bit about that.
Well, I guess the bulk of the studies would be under the category of cardiometabolic health, but there are at least one or two or more on asthma, on skin health. They have a topical version of this now that they
Yes, they do.
There's an anti-aging skin cream and a leave-on scalp cream. I'm a big fan. I don't even know if they're on the market yet, but they're very good. I think it's going to be the Beauty Quinn.
Beauty Quinn, yes, that's the name of the material.
So skin care, scalp care, asthma, diabetes. There's a study, there's a few studies, but that's part of metabolic health. So you're talking about, there's a reason this stuff's been around for thousands of years and has been used for everything. Usually there's wisdom in the crowds that way. I'm a big believer in science, but my greatest nutrition teacher that I ever had in my life said, the whole New York City Fire Department does not have one randomized controlled double-blind study showing that water puts out fire, but guess what? They noticed that it works. So, you can't just discount experience. And people have been using black seed oil as an elixir for lots of things, just like with apple cider vinegar. Then it turns out, as with apple cider vinegar, 100 years later, they do some studies and they say, the vinegar lowers insulin. They find out that there actually are things. And I think that's the same thing here.
Very good.
Most of the research, most meaning that the more on this has been done than, say, on skin, is cardiometabolic health. So we're talking about insulin sensitivity, we're talking about blood sugar, triglycerides, all these things that make up metabolic syndrome or prediabetes appear to be positively impacted by black seed oil, by Thymoquin particularly. I say by black seed oil because a lot of the studies show that, but when we're talking about black seed oil, we have to be clear, it's just like with olive oil, it's one of the most faked foods in the world. The extra virgin olive oil. It's mislabeled all over the place. There was a book written about it called Fake Food. It's one of the 4 most faked foods. Well, black seed oil, there's a million different products. So when we talk about the value of this, we need a standardized one that we can believe in that has what it's supposed to have and has what it says it has on the label. And that's why I think, I just came from Supply Side West too, and I think I met at least 3 people who are now I'm sure it was more than that, but in a fast 5-minute, visit at the booth, I met 3 different formulators who are using this. And I think it's just going to grow because it's a very reliable source of a very important ingredient.
Well, thank you for that. And could you elaborate a little bit about what is the research on Thymoquin for reducing cortisol? Tell us maybe a little bit about that.
Well, I again, as I said, Sean Talbot, who is a researcher and an expert in cortisol, did a very excellent, well-designed study, and he tested a number of different metabolic parameters. He also tested, by the way, sense of well-being. I forgot that. That was one of the parameters that he looked into as well. And he found that in a very well-designed 1-month study, I think it was a washout study where everybody got both treatments, and he found a 44% reduction in cortisol with the use of Thymoquin. And that is a very impressive, statistically significant result that should impress anybody.
Makes sense. Okay. I didn't know if maybe there was some other research, but thank you for clarifying that. So, if somebody is lowering their cortisol levels successfully, what might those people expect? What benefits might they see from lowering the cortisol?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked this question. So our sympathetic nervous system has 2 branches, I'm sorry. The nervous system has two branches that we're going to mention right now: the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The sympathetic nervous system is known as the fight or flight system. The parasympathetic is known as the rest and digest part of the nervous system. So sympathetic nervous system is running for the airplane, getting that report done, kicking the kids, running, doing. And the rest and digest, the parasympathetic is, let's relax. Let's digest our food. Let's have a bath. Now, about 3 or 4 years ago, and this is a very interesting story I think that your listeners will love. A very distinguished, I can't remember his last name, Dr. Jeffrey something, chief of staff at a major hospital in Boston, faculty of one of the major universities. He was, this is an MD who also picked up a master's degree in divinity at Princeton on the way to Harvard, okay? So he's a guy who's very open to spiritual stuff and things like that, but he's also a hardcore scientist. And during this time, there was a lot of talk about faith healers in Brazil. And people were making pilgrimages to see this guy, John of Brazil, something like that. And he had people who were saying, you know, Doc, you ought to investigate this stuff. These people are getting better. And he'd say, are you kidding? I wouldn't. First of all, it's all BS. And second of all, even if I didn't think it was BS, which I do, I would be laughed out of the scientific community if I ever investigated something like that. And he had an oncology nurse that he had worked with for 20 years who he had the utmost respect for. And she said, you know, Jeffrey, I do actually think there's something to this. You should actually get a grant and investigate it. And really against his better judgment, but because he had such respect for this oncology nurse, he did actually do this study on how people if there is such a thing as miracle healing or faith healing or overnight healing or somebody's cancer just goes into right, that kind of stuff that you hear about. He said, okay, I'm going to look into it. And he came back, and I'm paraphrasing, but I'm giving you he said, 98% of it's total bullshit. But 2% isn't. And he was able to locate people who had had actual pictures taken, x-rays, supervised treatment, doctor's notes, and tumors had gone away. And things that were never expected to heal had healed. Was very rare, but it happened. And it could be collaborated. It could be proven. It could be shown scientifically. And he said, he wrote a book about this. It's called Cured, C-U-R-E-D. And he said, look, these people may be 1 in a million, but shit, we study Bill Gates, we study Michael Jordan, we study Tony Robbins, we study the big performers, the people who are the exceptions to the rule, who do unbelievable things. Maybe we can learn from them. Maybe even though it's 1 in a million people, we should take a look and see what we can learn. So he did. And he wrote that book, Cured. And this is what he found. All healing takes place in the parasympathetic nervous system mode.
That makes sense.
What these people had done, and they were not necessarily educated. Some of them were like, you know, they were factory or whatever, but they had these inoperable cancers, and what they had done without thinking about it, without necessarily saying, I'm going to do this, they had eliminated toxicities from their lives. Some of them quit their jobs. Some of them went into other fields. Some of them said, you know, I only have 6 months to live. I'm going to go in the beautiful Brazil or Costa Rica or, you know, St. Martin. I'm going to just enjoy life. But whatever it is that they did, they had moved from being 100% in sympathetic mode, cortisol, to 90% in parasympathetic mode. And that, he believes, is what allowed their immune system to come back full force and go, oh, wait a minute, I can kill this. I can get rid of this. But they were sleeping because cortisol was so high. So if you ask, what can people expect by lowering cortisol into healthy levels? A lot.
Very good. That's a great story. Thank you for sharing it
I
with
think
us.
you'd like it. It's very inspiring to me because my message for the last, I don't know, quite a few years now has been about this and about, I get asked a lot to talk about cholesterol, and I get a lot of client requests from people whose doctors are putting them on statins based on, ancient numbers that don't count for anything like total cholesterol and stuff like that. And my message to all my clients has been recently that the stuff that really matters the most for a long and healthy life is your relationships, your state of mind, your connection to other people. And so metabolic health is really like the thing that drives me. And I believe that the stuff we're talking about, which is very related to lowering cortisol and to getting into a mode in which you're more relaxed, you're more connected, you're more able to have your immune system function the way it was always meant to function when it's not being suppressed by high levels of cortisol. So I think this is all connected to living longer and living better. And to, not only does healing take place in the parasympathetic mode, so does detoxification, and so does fat burning. You know how they always say muscles don't get built while you're doing the muscle building, while you're doing the bicep curls? It gets built in the recovery time. And
Right.
that is 100% true. I was a trainer for I don't know how many years when I started in the 90s at Equinox. Muscle doesn't get built when you're tearing it down when you're doing bicep curls. You're
Right.
building it up when you're resting and relaxing. And it's kind of the same thing in life. You're building resilience, connection, optimism, joy, all those things in parasympathetic mode. And you can't be in parasympathetic mode when cortisol is on 100% of the time. That's why
That's
we want to lower it.
that is exactly correct. So, as long as we're talking a little bit about thymoquinone, one of the two articles I wrote about it, I think there's something worth bringing up, and that is that thymoquin, thymoquin works great by itself, but there's actually studies on combining thymoquin with some other nutraceuticals, and they
Um,
found that in doing that, there's been some pretty good results. Are you familiar with any of that research? Is that worth
Yes, the
mentioning?
research is the one you're talking about is the research that combined thymoquin specifically with omega 3s from fish oil.
Yep.
Now, I am a huge fan of fish oil. It's one of what we talked about foundational products for metabolic health, and I said I had three of them. That's one of them. So fish oil has always been on my short list of things to recommend for just about everybody because the benefits are so strong. Combining it with thymoquin, pretty nice. So that's what that research showed. It showed a nice statistical bump in good metrics of the type that we are talking about. I don't have the study in front of me, so I can
Yeah,
tell you,
I would
but
just
it's
mention
omega
that.
three thymoquin.
Yeah, it's a great combination, and what they found was that even a low concentration of thymoquin together with the omega threes had a greater anti-inflammatory effect, and we know omega threes are great as anti-inflammatory
They
agents
are.
naturally. And so I just wanted to mention to our listening audience that you know the combination together is something well worth considering. And in fact, just in case anybody wants to know, there's also research on it with thymoquin with vitamin D3. There's research on it with astaxanthin. There's research showing that even research where thymoquin was used in a cell culture study with CBD and found some really significant effects, including anti-inflammatory effects. So, it seems as though when you combine thymoquin with other things, you get some excellent results. Even studies done with pycnogenol, studies done with beta carotene and lutein, some pretty cool stuff. I mean, this thymoquin, is just really awesome stuff. Works really well together, but really does work super well when you combine it with other nutraceuticals. So just wanted to toss that in for good measure because I thought it was worth mentioning.
If I were, I don't formulate. I think I've been involved maybe in 2 or 3 formulated products, one of which won a Next to You award, by the way. But if I were a formulator, I would look very carefully and strongly at thymoquin as an ingredient for all the reasons that you mentioned, not only as a standalone, but to be combined with so many of these other things for even more synergistic effect. And believe me, you mentioned anti-inflammation. I don't even know if we're allowed to say that anymore because the American Medical Association has decided inflammation is a disease. So we people in the
the FDA has jumped on that.
Broccoli is anti-inflammatory. I guess this is disease. Don't get me started. The point is, inflammation is a very big component of most conditions that we don't want to have. And as is oxidative damage. So whenever you're mentioning, oh, it has anti-inflammatory, let's not discount that. That is very, very, very important. And as you point out, it's been shown in most of these studies and shown sometimes even more dramatically in the combo studies.
Yeah, and it is. I echo what you said. Anti-inflammatory effects. There's so much inflammation going on today. And not every inflammation is even a result of a disease state. I mean, for example,
we need inflammation to live.
We do.
But cortisol, you just don't want it on all the time.
Right. And things like one can overexercise and get a little more inflammation. One can eat certain kinds of junk foods. Studies have shown that increases inflammation. You can be in a cold climate and have a higher inflammatory load, just what your body does. So there can be different reasons one has higher levels of inflammation. And if you have aches and pains and other problems, and you have higher levels of inflammation present, that might be worse. So anything you can do that can help that situation resolve to some extent is great. And that, Thymoquin is certainly one of those things. So I would like to ask you if you have, because you've told us some interesting stories, and I'd just like to know if you have any last-minute words of wisdom for people who want to live long, but even more importantly, live a healthy life.
Would you say that again?
Yeah. What is your words of wisdom for people who are interested in living longer, but more importantly, they want to live a healthy life? What are your words of wisdom to them?
I go right back to what I was telling you earlier, which is, I'll tell you a story. Peter Attia, who is, in my judgment, one of the greatest doctors in America, and wrote maybe the best book ever written on anti-aging called Outlive. 6 months on the New York Times bestseller list. You notice how many other people's books I plug when I do a podcast, but it's a great book. Peter Attia talks about the kick-ass 100-year-old. And his goal for us is to be kick-ass 100-year-olds. That's what we want to be. So he defined, what does that look like? And he made a list of things that he would think, and we would think, a kick-ass 100-year-old. You saw, if this was your neighbor and he was 100 years old and he could do these things, you'd say, that guy's kick-ass. What is it? They're very simple things. Can you carry your groceries from the car to the house? Can you put a 10-pound or a 20-pound bag in the overnight compartment of an airline? Can you do a farmer's carry, which is 2 bags, 50 feet up the street? I do it sometimes with kettlebells. Very basic stuff. And then Peter Attia, being also a mathematician and kind of obsessive about data, then sketched out what you had to do each decade of your life in order to affect the natural decline in muscularity, balance, stability, and all that. So you have to do this much stability, this much balance, this much weight training, this much cardio, and over the course of a lifetime, and then you would be a kick-ass 100-year-old. And there are a lot of people, biohacking community, they're doing ice baths, they're for their adrenals, they're doing all these things, right? And they want to be kick-ass 100-year-olds. So some researchers recently said, this is a great goal. But why don't we see if we can find some kick-ass 100-year-olds and ask them what they did? Like, let's reverse engineer it. Let's find some kick-ass 100-year-olds and observe them in their environment. So they did. And they went, as you can imagine, to one of the blue zones, which is Sardinia. The blue zones, for people who don't know, are the 5 areas around the globe. I could probably kick them off, but it's Sardinia is one of them. Okinawa is another. Loma Linda in California is a third. There's a peninsula off Nicaragua. Anyway, there are 5 areas, and Sardinia is one of them. And Sardinia happens to have the highest population of 100-year-old men who are fully functioning in the world. In the world. So they go to Sardinia and they observe. They go, what lessons can we learn from kick-ass 100-year-olds? We're already doing it. They do a lot of ice baths. Did they, do split training in the gym? Did they do, what did they do? What do they do? How did they get it? And they came away, and this is a little tongue-in-cheek, but not that much, but it's a little tongue-in-cheek, you'll see what I mean. The third lesson, that I'm going to work backwards in order of the amount of the variance it accounted for, the importance of these things. So number 3 was live in a place with lots of stairs. Now, if you've ever seen a picture of Sardinia, if you ever watched the 2nd season of White Lotus, you know that Sardinia is, you can't walk out of your house and get a carton of milk without walking like 10,000 steps. It's all steps up and down and hills and down. You walk everywhere. So the lesson really of this is not move to a place, it's move all the time. Walk everywhere, right? That was lesson number 3. Lesson number 2. What do you think these guys did all day? They were shepherds. So they would, going back to our parasympathetic mode that we talked about earlier and lowering cortisol, remember that? These guys go out into the beautiful hills of Italy and spend their time with sheep, which are the gentlest, sweetest, most docile animals in the world. And they do that for 8 hours a day. What do you think that does to their nervous system, Gene?
I would imagine it would cause it to be in a nice parasympathetic state, very calm, very relaxed.
Okay, so lesson number 2 is be around a lot of gentle animals. Now, you can take that lesson and translate it any way you want, but you get the essence of it, right?
Yeah.
The number 1 lesson, with a bullet, in the way they say, what's the 3 most important things in real estate? Location, 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 right? This was the location, location, location of living well and living longer, just what you just said, right? Here was the number 1 lesson. Make friends and family your number 1 priority, period. It's more important than your blood tests. It's more important than your calcium scan. That is the predictor. And it's not just that study in Sardinia. It's the happiness study. This is a 4-generation study out of Harvard, been going on since 1936, where they have looked at people and watched what their health outcomes were over 4 generations. What did they do? What did they eat? How did they exercise? What did they do? What's their life like? And what are the endpoints? How many of them die? What habits can we find? What are the things that predict long life and long health? You know what it was? The same damn thing. Social connections.
Makes sense. Makes a great deal of sense.
Right. And what is all of this doing? One of the things it does, it's certainly not the only thing, but this is the connection to what we're talking about lowering stress hormones and how important that is for health. And that's really when you ask, what does lowering cortisol do? And what does getting it in a healthy range do? And what can people expect? And why is this good? That's why it's good, man. Because it's a great predictor of living long and living well.
And so those, for the listeners today, keep in mind that in addition to doing some of these wonderful things that Dr. Jonny Bowden talked about to keep yourself in a more of a parasympathetic state, calm, less cortisol going on. We also discussed Thymoquin as a means to help lower cortisol levels. And that is something that, if it's a material you're interested in using, that's from TriNutra. And again, it's distributed in the US by Barrington. So I want to thank you, Jonny, for joining us on the call today. It was most informative. And thank you to the listeners. And just want to remind you, if you like what you heard, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.